Okay. Before you get to going with your painting, you want to take a very close look at how I laid out my colors on the palette. This is called mise en place. Mise en place means everything in its place. Much of painting, in fact, the majority of painting, other than the biggest facet, which is learning how to see color and light, is actually remembering the mixtures. So in a way, you're a sort of magician. And I have you work with very specific colors because they do a couple of different things. You'll note that when you put out your colors, you'll have two versions of everything, except for white and except for black. So you'll have two versions of yellow, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre. You'll have two versions of red, cadmium red, alizarin crimson. You'll have two browns, burnt sienna, burnt umber. You'll have basically one blue. I think I just had you get ultramarine. Maybe I had you get phthalo blue. No? Phthalo blue is a really good alternative, but it can really get away from you. It mixes a great black. I had you get a green, which was sap green, and what was the other one? Do you remember? Viridian. I didn't put any Viridian on here because I don't really need it for this painting. All right? So here are a couple of rules. I'm going to give you some rules. Obviously, in art school, we give you rules so that you have a foundation down the line. You know when to break them, okay? When you put black on your palette, some of you bought black, some of you did not. When I use black, I never use it to darken. I only use it to make a color. So if I just take a very small amount with one of my brushes or my palette knife, which is typically what I use to mix, if I take my black, and the light is really low here, but if I take my black and I mix it with yellow, I'm gonna get a green. So when I say you're mixing color with black, that's the objective, not use black to make a shadow. If you use black to make shadows or to make values, what will happen is your image will become completely desaturated because that's what black does. It pulls color away. It desaturates and it nullifies a color. So if I'm just gonna go jump right into the painting, how I set up my, my palette is such that I have an open mixing well in the center. I keep my light and natural colors, so any color that might just naturally exist in nature, white, yellow, yellow ochre, red, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, burnt umber, all on one side. Those are warms. And then I keep my cools on the other side. So my blue, my green, my black, I have it, okay? And I segregate them knowing that my entire frame of logic is about playing with this balance of temperature. Okay, so I'm not gonna talk your ear off about it. I'm just gonna get right to it. I've got a very simple still life. The very first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna plan my composition, and I'm not gonna work terribly hard at this composition, but I'm gonna jump right into it. I typically use my burnt umber as a means to sort of plan things out. I have a side heavy composition because I've got a deep shadow structure here, so I'm going to lean out my objects. Plan it out. I've got a ridge here that I am going to indicate like a plane. It gives me visual interest. I can use a straight edge if I want to. And I've got this wonderful thing happening back here, which is gonna give me some visual interest, which is that, I don't know what that is, that little thing there, but you can figure it out. I am drawing my shadow structures because they create balance. So that is a shadow, that is a shadow. Now, some people do an entire value scheme. And they will basically do like a value structure that is a sort of mock grisaille. because the first bit that you put down on your canvas or your panel basically stains it. You can't really get rid of it. So this drawing isn't really gonna go anywhere. Once it's there, it's there. So I can spend some time on this. I can put in some value if I want to, but the reality is I actually don't paint that way. I typically don't do a whole value scheme unless I'm doing a really, really slow painting. And the paintings that we're working on right now are gonna be fairly swift. So I'm just gonna indicate this stuff where it is, but I'm not really gonna do the details. I'm not committing to any of that. All right, so I'm gonna jump right into the color, which is what you genuinely care about. So when I've got a wet brush, I typically just sort of set it to the side, knowing that I'll probably pull from it. I don't always clean it because I don't want them completely saturated because it will make my paint soupy, okay? So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna deal with my background because I'm gonna work from the front to the back and take off anything that I didn't want. And I'll mix the first thing that I need to do is I need to establish the temperature of the thing that I am describing. I am describing the wall in the back, all right? Compared to the still life that I'm actually looking at, is the wall in the back cool or warm?
Warm.
Why do you say warm?
Because like yellow hue.
Isn't this the warmest thing? So comparatively speaking, warm or cool?
Cool.
So I'm gonna mix a gray, and I'm not gonna use my black in order to do it. How I mix a gray is I take, generally my go-to is burnt umber, which is my cool brown, and a little bit of my blue. And I'm gonna take that ultramarine blue, pick it up, and that makes a black. And I can play with that temperature of that black. I can either make it a warm black or I can make it a cool black based on how much color I put in it. But the two essentially cancel each other out, okay? So I'll pick up that white, see what happens. Scrape it, roll it, mix it. It's like a little dance on TikTok. I need to make it a little cooler, add a little bit more blue. And what I typically do is I'll mix that color and I'll think about the local color of that thing. So I've got it mixed on my palette knife. I hold it up and I say, oh yeah, that's perfect for the shadow. So I drop it on for that shadow. I feel good about that. You see that how that's cool. It's like a purple gray. So I've got that shadow, but then I need to lighten it up because I went too dark. And I'm adding white to this because that's actually the part of the color. Hold it up. Maybe add a little bit more. Probably have to pick up a lot of that. And I'm actually gonna warm it up just a hair with a little bit of yellow. Just a hair, a scant. And I'm never mixing more than 3 colors, okay? So I'll throw it on there. It's significantly lighter than that. I feel good about this. I feel good about that color. I throw it on there. And this is the way to paint quickly. I might darken those shadows, knowing that I'm gonna have to deal with them in just a second, a little bit more. Just to have it on reserve for when I'm wanting to reach for it. I typically use like a hog hair fat bristle. Paint up to an edge. Paint up to an edge and a little bit into it, because it's easier for me to actually grow into the space with my focal point than to work around it with an edge. The trick to painting, a lot of painting is not only just about color, but it's also about turning your edges. And a lot of people don't know what that means when they're in school. They're like, Why is my professor saying this constantly to me? Turn your edges, turn your edges. What that means is you're creating essentially a volume that goes back into space. And you're focusing on what is soft perceptually and what is hard in terms of edge. So I'm not gonna worry about those like lines across yet. I'm just gonna suggest the shadow structure, soften it, let it fall back into space, and not fret. Some people always paint on a toned surface like I'm painting on now. That's up to you. Some people will fuss and blend everything. I don't do that. I like to get it on there. All right, so next color. I'm gonna paint this cardboard. Now that cardboard, what is it? Warm or cool? Warm. It's quite warm, isn't it? It's one of the warmest things in our setup. Now, yellow ochre is real convenient, but the problem is yellow ochre doesn't match it. So I have to mix it. So take my yellow ochre, because that's gonna be my foundation of that base. That's the closest thing I've got. So you pick the closest color that you can get, okay? And I'll say, okay, it's a little chalky of a color. It's not as bright yellow is what I got there. So I'm gonna take my cool brown, which is burnt umber, not burnt sienna. I take a little bit of that, mix it in there, see what happens. It's all about seeing what happens. And you'll note that I've darkened it as well. And when I hold it up and I compare it, it needs to be lightened a little bit. And it needs to actually be neutralized with a light like white. So I'll pick up a little of that white, see what happens. I can even walk over to it and just basically say, okay, that ain't quite there yet. Now, brown is warmer than blue. Blue is cool. If I add more brown to that, it's gonna warm it up, just a hair. So I might actually pick up a little bit of that blue and see what happens, because I'm seeing what happens. And I have a feeling I'm gonna get something real close. I may have to put more white. Will you root through my box and get more white for me? I think I got it, right there. Compare, and I'm damn near on it, okay? So I generally like to squeeze out probably 1 to 2, well, 2 or 3 times more white than I probably need, because you use a lot of it. And then obviously I'm keeping in mind what color schemes are gonna be most dominant, and obviously I'm gonna have a lot of reds in this one. So I'll pick up a little bit of that, a little bit more. I'm not being skimpy, and I feel good about that kind of neutral, you know, cardboard color. Throw it on there. Got a little black accidentally in there, so we're gonna take that off because we're fearless. And you don't need a ton of paint. If you put a ton of paint on there and you go hog wild with that, you're gonna fight against it. So you just need a little bit of paint to start, keep it in reserve so that you know how to mix it again and again. Does that make sense? Add more black on there. Scrape it off. And I'm not painting, you'll note I'm not painting these shadows yet, okay? I'm moving it around so I can have an even tone. I'm mixing with my surface, basically. This is called wet and wet. And I note that it gets a little darker as it goes away. As it rolls away, it gets a bit darker. So I'm gonna pick up a little bit of that blue and a little bit of that brown. I'm gonna mix it in with that local color that I essentially made. I'm gonna smudge it in there just a little bit because I'm gonna mix it wet and wet. I can run right into the shadow structure as I want. What did I say about the temperature of the light? if it's a warm light, what temperature is the shadow?
Cool.
And if it's a cool shadow, what temperature is the shadow?
Warm.
Good. So I've got a warm light, right? It's yellow. See that? So I'm looking at something that's gonna look a little bit purple compared to that brown. So I'm gonna pick up that blue again. That smudge of blue. I'm gonna take my burnt umber. Pick a little bit of my local color up because it's not a flat neutral. I'll compare it. Too dark. And then I'll slap it in there. Still too dark. And I'm not getting fussy about it just yet, all right? I can jump right in. Just move it around. You can play with brush mark, you can play with gradient here. You can play with edge. I'm just getting it on the surface at this point. You can do a lot more paint if you want. It's up to you. If you use too much paint, it's a fight. It's a battle. So some people choose to use little X marks to blend things in. I use check marks. It's typically how I draw. And I'm describing around my focal point, okay? And you'll note in the wet and wet technique, you have to go a little bit darker than the actual thing itself because it will all mix, right? And as it mixes, it's gonna lighten. All right, next step. I can do this if I want to, but I might just save that because we might not have time. I don't wanna eat up too much time. Okay, well, is it cool or light, my apples? How damn apples? Are they cool or are they light? Or are they cool or are they warm? Sorry. Yeah, they're warm. Very clearly warm. So I establish a local color first. So the local color for my red apple will be what? Will it be burnt, or will it be cadmium red? Exactly. Close. Really close. But I'm not a lazy sod. And so I'm actually gonna make the local color of that thing. So I take my cadmium red, I pick up a little bit of my alizarin crimson, and that's gonna be more of my local, the local color. So I'm gonna establish 3 values on everything I paint. I'm not gonna think about the details of the little spots on it. Like, please don't do that early. Because these are hour-long paintings. If it's an hour-long painting, those spots may never even come into fruition, okay? So the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna drop a little bit of burnt sienna on that side of where I mixed that, because I'm neutralizing that edge, because it becomes cooler as it goes away from me, and I'm dropping that in there as a plane. Back to that red. And I actually have some yellow in with that red on the side. A little bit more. And you'll note that the colors that you're working with, if they're student grade, you're gonna need to use a lot more color. So if you're working with actually professional cadmiums, like studio quality cadmiums, you only have to use a little bit. It really does just immediately tint everything. And then I'll drop in that dark there, which is gonna be quite cool. So I'll actually pick up that burnt umber, use a little bit of alizarin crimson in order to establish that tone. Try not to get it too dark. if you want to, you can model it in. I'm not gonna model it in. I like the way that looks. At this point, I can drop in a shadow if I want, or a highlight if I want to. It is gonna be like white and a touch of yellow because it's a yellow light. So don't just go right for your white when you're making a highlight. Think about the color of the light itself. The color of the light itself is quite yellow, and I'm just gonna drag that and use a little bit of a blending technique that just pulls it in. There will sometimes be like reflective color. So if what it's sitting on is quite light, it will bounce right back. So not only will that color bounce right back, but also that value will. So you can spend some time blending that if you want to. I like the way that looks. I'm not going to. I'm gonna move on to my next apple. I'm not gonna worry about that little thing yet because I wanna kind of finish that background before I go and describe what might be on top of it. Does that make sense? I go a little bit thicker with what I'm typically painting. I go a little bit thicker with what I'm painting in terms of my central focal point. And I'm not afraid to use my palette knife. I rely on my palette knife, especially when I'm doing like these 1 hour paintings. You can scrape it if you want to, you can add some dimension, whatever you want. All right, next color is a kind of lime green. I have polluted my well with red. Did you see that? So I actually need to put more yellow on the surface of this palette because polluting your well happens when you're working quickly. And it's not a good habit to get into because I basically ran through all that paint because I got some yellow in it. So I'm gonna isolate that color because I really want a pure color. Yellows are really hard to work with. I clean off my palette knife, make sure I don't have anything on there that I don't want. I've got some sap green on my palette here. And I'm gonna make that local color first. Feel good about that? Yes, there will be some white added on. And I do have to use quite a bit of that in order for it to actually lift. I'm gonna stick it on the whole thing before I actually start putting on those values. Yes, you can paint the individual values on their own, but I'm gonna go fairly thick with this and I'm working pretty swiftly. So I'll go right back to my green there. But it's too bright. You see how that's too bright? It needs to be neutralized. How do I neutralize a green?
Red.
Good. I added, what's the verb? Or the adjective, the complement. So I'm adding the complement to a color in order to neutralize it and to turn that form. When I notice that something is too brilliant or too heavily saturated, like SO, I need to deal with it. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go straight for my green, my sap green. I'm gonna add a little bit of the complement, and the complement to green is, but I've got 2 reds. So how do I know which one to use? Do you know? It has to do with the temperature. It also has to do with the value. So if I have a very dark green, which is what I do have, a very light red is not gonna help me out too much. It's that dark red that's gonna help me out. So I'll take that deep, deep red, I'll add a little bit, and then I see what happens. Now, that's a secondary way to make black. If you take your green, your sap green, and you use your alizarin crimson, you can make black. 2 ways to make black: burnt umber and ultramarine, sap green, and alizarin crimson. Commit those to memory, okay? See what happens? I might use my brush at this point. I'm gonna get a little bit more control, like Janet Jackson. A little too dark. Pick up a little bit more of my green. And then I'll turn it a little too dark, but I've got some other stuff going on here. And I've got this like shadow structure that goes all the way around it. I've already got color down, so I'm not too afraid to mix it in there. And you notice I significantly neutralized that. I have mostly light on the top. I'll soften my edges. I've got a big edge here. I can use another brush in order to basically just do what I was doing over here. I'm trying to keep them straight as half of it.
I have a question.
Please.
You said them apples are warm, but that one's green. Why is it still warm?
Well, it's warm because even cool colors can be warm. So a green can be on the blue side. Who asked that? Great. A green can be on the blue side and be cool, but a green can also be on the yellow side and be a warm green. Does that make sense? So there's there's a nice sliding scale with all colors, which is really beautiful that you begin to see. Okay, I'm gonna clean out my brush because it's nasty. Like Janet Jackson's 1986 album, Nasty. Soften, find maybe some,
So why'd you use a pure white highlight for the green apple?
because it already had yellow in it.
Ah, okay.
I also have a compression point underneath these things, so I'm gonna go right for my dark that I mixed earlier. We're gonna see what that looks like. It's not blue enough. I don't know, I can add my little bit there if I want to. You see, I'm not using black, right? And I'm just using simple strokes in order to define very simple things. I might do a little thing here. I don't think I'm gonna get into the whole description of this because I think I might just take too long if I do. You know, you can add a few of your little things if you want to, but I don't really see the need. Now, I like to use a straight edge in order to do a straight edge. So I'll actually take a ruler, a sacrificial ruler, or a piece of wood, and I will actually drop down my piece of wood in order to make a straight edge, and I'll paint right up against it. Yeah, it'll ruin your wood, but that's fine. If I were painting all of this, I would actually paint the little bit of overlap there. This, I might want to just throw it in there. I'm using burnt sienna and a little bit of yellow ochre in order to find this edge here. Nope. Before I actually define that plane, right? So I don't have to describe every little thing as a VIP, as an important facet of the composition. What I do have to think of it as is as design. In my mind, I have adequately described this. I would use a straight edge, by the way, but I don't have time. I would adequately describe this as context. I think that's visually interesting. I'm not getting nitpicky with it. There's no need for me to get nitpicky with this or to get overly descriptive. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to convince my viewer where to look, where and how to prioritize what's important in an image. This is a little thin. I probably go a little thicker over it, but I'm gonna stop there for the moment. And that is a 1 hour painting that I did in 15 or 20. okay? I probably would describe a little bit more, but it's at this point that I would kind of stop and assess and say, do I want that background? Am I gonna put that full background in? Do I like it the way it is? This is adding visual interest as the design, context. I could do a gradient and make it a little bit darker and a little bit more moody. I could certainly add some dimensionality and thickness to the other colors rather than allow the background to show through. I can go in with my palette knife and start to describe things in a more interesting way. I can use what's called sgraffito, which pulls out or scrapes lines into my painting. So play. But the thing is the idea is to get it done in an hour. Questions? Yes?
So you mainly just use the palette knife when applying paint to larger areas?
I use the palette knife to mix, because when I use a brush to mix, it throws it all up in the brush and I end up losing a lot of paint. So the palette knife is nice and crisp and it's a nice blade. So I mix with the palette knife. If I want to work fast, I'll apply. If I want to work fast, I'll apply with the palette knife.
Okay.
If I'm being very particular in a painting, I'll apply with a brush just like anybody else.
Okay.
But these are fairly swift, so I just make very economical decisions.
How are you making your oil cooperate? Because like when I was like doing my oil painting, she was like getting stuck.
Yep.
I don't know if it's because you use a lot of oil.
All right, we haven't gotten there yet, but don't use your Galkyd for the initial layers. Use your solvent. So your solvent is like water to your acrylic. It extends it, it makes it thinner. So use your solvent to thin it.
Just a little bit?
Just a little bit.
Okay.
There is a rule in painting called fat over lean, which I'm gonna tell you right now, but you're not gonna get it until later. Fat over lean. You have a fat, which is an oil, mixed in with a pigment. Fat with pigment. You can add more fat into that paint and make it thinner and make it more transparent. Make it see-through, right? That's making it fatter. You're adding fat, okay? If you are working in layers, and I might do 1 or 2 layers, 3 layers in a painting, the first layer should only be thinned with my solvent because you're not adding fat to it. The more layers I put on, the more fat I can add to it. So my medium, your Galkyd, your liquid, that's fat. So I'll allow myself to use a little bit more fat with each successive layer. Why does that rule exist? Because in the history of oil painting, when that rule is not followed, it cracks right off the canvas or the palette, or the panel. Fat over lean. Fat over lean. Repeat it in your head.